Today's morning speaker is Vicki Pedone, who, as you all know, is co-chair of the Curriculum Committee. Let's hear it for the Curriculum Committee. And even though she therefore has the power to put herself in as a speaker, I think we're in for a treat because we know she's a very good speaker. So I'll turn it over to Vicki. Tell us how we evolved from fossils.
Okay, I thought I had printed my notes big enough for me to read without my glasses, but just in case. Okay. New discoveries and technological advances in the past 25 years have resulted in an explosion of information concerning human evolution. Today, I will present some things that we know from physical evidence and what we don't know but hypothesize. If we were big-brained, world-dominating members of the clam family, we would have great fossil record. We could track our ancestry back through time and space. But humans have an absolutely lousy chance to become a fossil. We have almost everything working against us. We live and die on the surface of the land. For most of our history, there were no intentional burials. Carcasses were quickly scavenged so that bones were fragmented and scattered over wide areas. They rested on the ground and disintegrated into dust. In rare circumstances, hominids or parts of them were relatively quickly buried by sediment of lakes, rivers, bogs, and caves, where they were not subsequently disturbed by currents or scavengers. Much of the hominid fossil record consists of broken bones and incomplete, disarticulated skeletal remains. It is difficult indeed to try to identify a species from a few bone fragments. The biggest obstacle to a good understanding of human evolution, then, is that the fossil record is limited in both time and space. For example, in Africa, where most of human evolution occurred, we have fossils from only 5% of the total land area, where hominids had to have lived over a much wider area. And the fossil record is just as bad or worse elsewhere in the world. But new discoveries are made every year. To put together a timeline of hominin history, we need to know how old the fossils are. But we cannot currently date hominid fossils directly because organic matter, bones, and teeth quickly take up elements from the environment, and the resulting contamination makes obtaining an accurate age impossible. So we have to date the material in which the fossils are enclosed. Tremendous advances have been made in the past 25 years in dating minerals and sediment, so that new sites have been dated more accurately and older sites have been redated. DNA is a powerful tool, but it degrades over time. The most ancient hominid bone from which DNA has been extracted is 430,000 years. DNA from fossils will give us a much more detailed understanding of maybe the last 500,000 years, but probably not from earlier time. And unfortunately, not all bones that are 500,000 years or younger have sufficient usable DNA. So far, the genomes of about a dozen Neanderthal and several dozen early Homo sapiens have been sequenced. These are key in establishing when and where interbreeding occurred between Homo species. Some parts of the genetic code mutate at fairly predictable rates. So by counting up the mutations in these parts of the code, we can estimate the time it took to get there. So this gives us a molecular clock. By sequencing living primates, we have established the times when different groups split from their common ancestors. Orangutans split from gorillas, chimps, and humans about 14 million years ago. Then gorillas split from chimpanzees and humans about 8 million years ago. And chimps and humans last shared a common ancestor between 6 and 7 billion years ago. Advances in technology allow scientists to use geochemical methods to determine the diets of hominids. Carbon isotopes measured in teeth and even, believe it or not, in fossil dental plaque have been used to distinguish diets from forest and woodland plants from diets of plants from savanna grasslands. Nitrogen isotopes measured in collagen and tooth enamel indicate the amount of meat in the diet. The hominid fossil record is too sparse to develop a detailed family tree, but one thing we can say with confidence is that major changes in Earth systems during the time of hominid evolution profoundly impacted species diversification and survival. Humans are in the family Hominidae, which we share with orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. When we get to the tribe level of hominini, we share that only with chimpanzees and bonobos. The lineage that leads to us, Homos, the Homo genus, includes humans, directly related ancestors, and other closely related species. These form the hominins. Paleoanthropologists are a long way from agreeing on the number of genera and the number of species of hominins, but this diagram is a pretty good summary. The groups marked in orange, the early hominins, the Australopithecines, and Paranthropus, or the robust Australopithecines, have fewer physical characteristics similar to those of the modern humans outlined in blue, the genus Homo. An important thing to remember from this diagram is that throughout most of hominin history, there have been multiple genera and multiple species that coexisted. For example, at 2 million years, more than one species of 3 different genera, so at least 9 different species coexisted in Africa, some known from the same areas. This illustration, which is commonly called the March of Progress, was created in 1965. It shows that we evolved from a knuckle-walking, chimp-like creature in a linear descent with steady improvement toward Homo sapiens. The previous diagram of hominin history shows that there were many different ways of being a hominid throughout our 7 million year history. Each had different adaptations that made them successful, some for a very long time, much longer than humans have been around. The more discoveries that are made, the more complex the hominid tree is becoming. Many anthropologists support the idea that the common ancestor, the one on the far left, had an upright body position in the trees and walked on 2 legs on the ground, similar to modern gibbons. It did not resemble the modern chimp any more than it resembled the modern human. The oldest fossils that we identify as hominin have skeletal features that show bipedalism on the ground. Hence, as we split from our common ancestor, hominins continued to evolve more efficient bipedalism, whereas chimpanzees evolved into knuckle walkers. Remember that chimps too have experienced 7 million years of evolution since the split. So how do we identify that a fossil is a hominin? Anatomical differences between humans and chimpanzees have accumulated over 7 million years. So as we go back in time, the differences become less as we get closer to the common ancestor. So characteristics assumed to be closer to that of the common ancestor are called primitive. Characteristics of traits that are closer to those of modern humans are called derived. 3 characteristics are most important in recognizing a hominin fossil: evidence of bipedalism, more derived traits in the skull, and more derived traits in dentition. Given our sparse fossil record, we are fortunate that anatomical changes that indicate bipedalism occur in bones from your feet to your head. So let's start with the feet. Chimpanzees need flexible feet to grasp tree limbs. Humans need stiff feet to push off from the ground. Anatomical changes in foot bones show stiffening of the outer foot over time and the disappearance of the grasping big toe to become aligned with the rest of the toes. Curved toes become straighter. Ankle bones also reflect added strength for graded stability. Those of you that have had babies, you may know this. I didn't. Humans are born with more or less parallel legs. If you look at your legs now, they are no longer parallel. Your knees go inward toward each other. The act of walking is what causes the knee to angle inward. This is necessary to balance the body weight above the ankle. If this is found in a fossil, it had to have walked on 2 legs because it is a developmental change in that individual. This is called the valgus knee, and it has been found in fossils that are 4 million years old. The femoral head that fits into the hip joint becomes longer and more robust over time to absorb more stress and provide more stability. Fossils as old as 6 million show this. The pelvis becomes shorter and bowl-shaped. This keeps the muscles in humans on the side of the body, so they allow you to balance on one leg. The ape pelvis is geared for extension of the leg to the back. Well, we can't do that very well, okay? But it allows them to climb. Okay? So this is why when you see a chimp take walking on 2 legs, it wobbles side to side, because it doesn't have the same musculature we do because of the pelvis. The ape back is fairly straight and stiff, making it difficult for them to stand vertically upright over their hips. The human spine forms an S curve. The curvature in the lower back allows us to lever our torsos up above our hips. Long arms are not needed if they're not used for locomotion. Longer hands become shorter and curved fingers become straighter. And finally, the skull also shows evidence of bipedalism. The foramen magnum is the hole through which the spinal cord passes into the brain. In apes, it is positioned at the back of the skull, and in humans, it's dead center in our skull. Adaptations to bipedalism were not identical in every species. Reconstruction of fossil anatomies show that hominin species that overlapped in time and space had different gaits and different ways of walking on two legs. Early hominins and Australopithecines also maintained adaptations for spending time in trees. Even after 2 million years, some of these species, the outlined in orange, continued to possess adaptation to life in the trees long after other hominins, those shown in blue, had fully committed to life on the ground. So let's look at some other ways that the skull can tell us that a fossil belongs in the hominin lineage. We've already seen one feature, the position of the foramen magnum. So what else is used? Okay. Primitive traits are on the left, of course, and derived on the right. Prognathism is the degree of protrusion of the face below the eyes. The supraorbital brow ridge is the bony ridge above the eyes. The nasal bone can be peaked or flat. The forehead can be vertical or backward sloping. And the chin is either present or absent. Size of the cranium is also used. In comparison here, I put the chimpanzee, size of the chimpanzee brain at 380 to 400 cubic centimeters, and modern humans at 1350 to 1400 cc's. Dentition is the other main characteristic that helps identify a hominin. Fortunately, teeth are more highly mineralized than bone and often preserved more readily. The most striking difference between chimp and human are the canine teeth. Large canines have two impacts on overall dentition. A diastema, or gap, between the incisor and the canine in the upper jaw is needed to create space for the lower large canine when the mouth is shut. Obviously, humans don't have that. Large canines, upper canines, wear against the front lower premolars, creating a sharpened edge on the side of the canine. This is a process known as honing. Small canines, on the other hand, do not cause honing, and they wear on the tips instead of their sides. So let's look at the differences in dentition between chimpanzee, Australopithecus, and Homo sapiens. All apes and all hominids have the same dental formula. That is, we all have 32 teeth and the same number of each kind of tooth. So we're going to look now at the trends in hominids of derived versus primitive. So derived traits are small canines, the loss of the diastema in the upper jaw, and loss of honing of the canines. There is a decrease in the size of cheek teeth in hominids. Note, chimps aren't hominids, so they have small cheek teeth. And the last thing we'll look at is the shape of the dental arch, from a U shape to a rounded V or parabola shape in humans. The farther we go back in human history, the fewer fossils we have discovered. These have the fewest derived traits and are most like the common ancestor. During the period between 7 and 4 million, 4 species of hominins are identified. The 4 species are placed in 3 different genera. Each has several derived traits that place them in the hominid lineage. Important to note here also is the geographic area represented by these discoveries. The oldest fossils have been found in Chad in 2002. They made the news not just because they were the oldest fossils, but because they were the first African hominid fossils found outside of eastern or southern Africa. Fossils of this species represent at least 6 individuals, including one remarkably complete, though distorted skull. A reconstructed skull using CT scans showed that the foramen magnum was further toward the center than toward the back of the skull, consistent with some level of bipedalism. There is reduced prognosism. The canines are somewhat reduced in size. Brain size is similar to that of a modern chimp. The sediment and associated fossils with Sahelanthropus lived in a well-watered, forested environment. The best represented early hominin is Ardipithecus ramidus. In 1994, a nearly complete female skeleton of at least 110 bones was found in Ethiopia and nicknamed Ardi. Fossils of more than 30 individuals have been found. The short, broad pelvis of Ardi, compared to living apes, suggested that she could walk on 2 legs without wobbling. However, the shape of the lower pelvis is more ape-like and provided an anchor for powerful climbing muscles. The brain case is still the size of a chimp. The hands and feet are not like either humans or apes. They indicate that Ardi did not knuckle walk or swing adeptly through trees, but must have walked along branches, grasping them with hands, and with feet that had opposable big toes. Associated plant and animal fossils indicate that their habitat was woodlands and forests, with fig and palm trees. Carbon isotopes show that they ate a diet of fruits and leaves. The genus Australopithecus existed from 4.2 to 1.9 million years, over a 2 million year long history. At least 5 species of Australopithecines have been recognized, with several more that are still debated. Specimens of Australopithecines have been found throughout eastern and southern Africa. Many species are represented by a significant number of specimens. The wide distribution, diversity, abundance, and long duration of Australopithecines demonstrate that they were a highly adaptable and successful group, well adapted to changing environmental conditions in Africa during their existence. They were likely the smartest creatures on the planet. Overall, Australopithecines are characterized by smallish craniums, reduced canines, large chewing teeth, short legs, and short stature. They show adaptations that indicate they were capable bipeds that retained some climbing ability to move in the trees. I chose the best documented species, Australopithecus afarensis, to illustrate the genus. Afarensis has a million-year-long range from 3.9 to 2.9 million years. More than 500 specimens have been found in Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia, including nearly complete skeletons of an adult male, adult female, and child. These are all not found together. There are slightly different ages. Afarensis was a habitual biped on the ground, though with a different gait than modern humans, and probably could not walk long distances. Anatomical features indicate upright walking are found in the vertebrae column, the femoral neck, the bowl-shaped pelvis, the valgus knee, and the feet. The big toe is in line with the other toes. Canine teeth are relatively small, and there is no canine premolar honing or diastema. The skull shows attachments, however, for stronger chewing muscles than modern humans. Afarensis has a prognathic face and a slightly domed cranial vault that range from about 385 to 550 cubic centimeters. 3 partial skeletons of Afarensis have been found in Ethiopia within 50 kilometers of each other. The first and most famous of the Afarensis specimens, of course, is Lucy, dated at 3.2 million, found in Ethiopia in 1974. Afarensis retained upper body characteristics that still allowed it to be an adept tree climber, specifically adaptations in the shoulders, arms, wrists, and hands. The rib cage was cone-shaped. It tapered upward from a broad bipedal pelvis to narrow shoulders that had joints that faced upward instead of outward, like ours. They probably slept in trees to avoid predators. Everyone knows the story of how Lucy got her name, but few know that the leading scientists that found her thought she should have an Ethiopian name. Visitors to the site from the Ethiopian Ministry of Culture shortly after her discovery suggested Dinkinesh, which means "you are wonderful" in Amharic. Unfortunately, the name Lucy stuck. Physical and chemical studies of the teeth of Afarensis indicate a diet that included some savanna plants as well as leaves and fruits. Afarensis probably foraged extensively on the ground, as well as in trees, in an environment that consisted of open woodlands and open brushlands. They were adaptable opportunists that were able to take advantage of whatever the changing environment offered. It is widely thought that different populations of Australopithecus gave rise to 2 new genera, Paranthropus and Homo, both of which coexisted with later species of Australopithecus in eastern and southern Africa. Paranthropus originated about 2.6 million years ago and went extinct at 1.3. 3 species are widely accepted. Paranthropus is characterized by massive, thick enameled cheek teeth and skulls that have prominent features for muscle attachment. These were needed to generate massive chewing forces. Isotope analyses of the teeth of Paranthropus indicate that their diet was dominated by tough, fibrous plants of the savanna. Paranthropus and early Homo species coexisted in both eastern and southern Africa, but it is unknown if they actually ever encountered each other. Paranthropus specialized in chewing large amounts of low-quality vegetation. Homo lacked these adaptations for chewing and must have had other foods that were easier to digest and chew. We can physically measure the brain sizes of many hominids, and we see the sizes increasing from Ardipithecus. There is considerable overlap in both time and the size of the brain. But brain size alone cannot tell us how they thought. We cannot see changes in cognition from fossils. We can only surmise this from evidence from behavior. The first evidence of new thinking is the making of stone tools. The first undisputed stone tools are from the oldest bed in Olduvai Gorge, dated at 2.6 million. This old bed in Olduvai Gorge contains fossils of both Homo habilis and Paranthropus. From this time forward, evidence of tool use occurs over broad areas of the African landscape. There is limited evidence of possible tool use from cut marks on two bones at one 3.4 million year old site and possible tools, large flakes from another site that are called the Lumbaquian tools, dated at 3.3 million. Until additional evidence of tool making is found, it will remain a hotly debated topic concerning which genus, Australopithecus or Homo, first made and used tools. Part of the history of that is Louis Leakey was adamant that it had to be Homo, and they found Paranthropus first in that old bed at Olduvai Gorge, and he was devastated and kept going and going until finally he found one jaw that he called Homo habilis, because it had to be Homo. Right now, though, the pendulum is swinging, and more paleoanthropologists are siding with the Australopithecines. Now is a good time to change focus a bit and look at the impact of Earth's climate on environmental conditions in Africa during hominin evolution. The early hominin species, you can see outlined in blue that time zone, the early hominin species evolved during the late Miocene and early to middle Pleistocene epochs, when climate was warmer and wetter throughout most of Africa. Dense forest existed in many areas, favoring life and food sources in the trees. During the late Pleistocene, average global temperature started to drop, causing cooler and drier conditions in much of Africa. In these areas, forests became less dense and open woodlands and brushlands formed. Still, overall climate was warmer and wetter than it is today. Australopithecus afarensis lived during this late Pliocene epoch, and as already noted, had a diet that included both forest and a little bit of savanna-type plants, as they foraged on the ground as well as in trees in these open woodland areas. At the end of the Pliocene, around 2.6 million years, first red bar there, permanent ice began to form in the Arctic. This caused a major change in Earth's systems and defines the start of the Pleistocene epoch. What is critical about the climate of the Pleistocene is that it becomes highly variable, cycling abruptly and often between wet, warm, interglacial, and cool, dry glacial cycles. Because changes were frequent and rapid, they caused environmental stress on all plants and all animals. During the Pleistocene, woodlands in eastern and southern Africa were replaced by grassland savannas. It's important to note that during interglacial times, though, there was more moisture and food sources were more abundant. However, the next time that when it changes to glacier, they go away. So boom and bust is not a good thing for long-term survival of a species. So this changing environment was undoubtedly challenging for our ancestors, but it offered new opportunities to make a living. For example, the Paranthropus developed adaptations to eat savanna plants, members of the Homo genus took a different route. And I will stop there for now and pick up later so if there are any questions, do that.
Okay, I'm Anne, and I'm a language teacher, so this is a language question for us, not for the beings you've been talking about. But I noticed that the names of the Homo species started to show European locations. So it seems as if becoming Homo was coinciding with movement out of Africa, just looking at the names of where the fossils were found.
Yes, some of them, although some of them, as they found later, like I'm talking about that Homo in the second half. And so there is one species, the Homo heidelbergensis, that I'll talk about, that has that name. The first fossils were found in Germany, but the oldest fossils are found in Africa. So it depends on where they were found. Usually they named it after the location, yeah.
I'm also just kind of curious as when you're going to bring fire in.
Second half.
Okay. Okay, right.
I'm Susan, and I wanted to ask, when you say quick changes, what do you mean by quick?
Quick.
How many years or
It means
millions?
it
or
probably
whatever?
happened within a century. Because climate change, we know that the last glacial collapse really, it was less than a century where we felt the things. So these things happen quickly. It used to be thought they were gradual, the ice melts slowly and blah, 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 and then we finally enter a glacial, but we find that that's not what happens. There's massive collapse and reorganization of climate in a quick sense. So if you're used to having nice grasslands and water and then maybe the next generation or 2 generations later, it's not there. It's hard for species to adapt quickly like that, as humans are going to be finding out. Yes.
Hi, Vicki. Well, one thing from your geology perspective that you might be able to give us more insight on, why is it that these oldest fossils are found in Africa majority-wise? Is there a geological reason why these oldest fossils survived there?
Because that's where hominins evolved.
So it has nothing to do with geology? It's just...
No, it has nothing to do with the geology. Nope.
Hi, I'm John. So what caused the extinction of the other branch, the Proanthropus? Was it competition with the Homo, or was it
we don't
climate
know.
reasons? Or
We don't know. It's often, expected. I'll talk a little bit about extinction, and one of the things we have to think about are numbers. We're used to this, billions and billions of Homo sapiens. Well, the early hominids probably were very limited in number. They didn't have billions of them or even millions of them. So if you have small populations, again, to find food, they probably formed smaller groups. Australopithecines are thought to have lived in actually larger numbers than sometimes the Homo species for protection, because like a lot of animals, if you live in a larger group, when predators attack, they'll pick off a couple, but the rest will be okay. So if you have relatively small populations, that experience a lot of stress. They'll get smaller and smaller. There can be inbreeding. They are genetically weakened, and eventually they die out. I mean, no species, many of these, you looked at the one species, Afarensis species, carried on for about 1 million years. I don't give humans that. So, you know, things go extinct.
That's very encouraging. I'm wondering whether the fossils and the bones, I wonder if the findings of fossils and bones and the like also tell us stories about the culture, not just the stature and where they were walking or not, like how they interacted, what...
Mm-hmm. Not until the first evidence of culture are the tools. Other than that, we have no physical evidence. So that's like the beginning of archaeology, when you find materials related to not the bones themselves, but materials related to the culture. And so the first ones, the first evidence we have of that are actually the stone tools. So it's quite some time before we see more culture. It's much closer in time to us that they're preserved, because some of the things in the culture are things that rot and don't preserve, like, you know, fur and bone and things, wood tool. You know, maybe some of these people used wood tools, but we will never know that because they don't preserve. We don't have any preserved, you know, wooden tools.
I'm David. You were talking about getting DNA and doing tests with that, and you also talked about the mineralization of teeth. One of the things that's always interesting to me is they talk about getting DNA from teeth, and can you tell me how that's done? Where do they get that?
Most efforts to actually directly date fossils have been total failures, because there's still some porosity in teeth. There's a lot in bone, and still some in teeth. And if they're there long enough, water, things that move through it, add minerals. They fill in gaps and exchange ions. And so when you date it, you're not really dating the original material. So this contamination has a big chance of giving you a false date. And the other thing is, there's no easy way to correct for it, because you don't know whether the contamination is 5%, 10%. It makes a big difference in calculating the age. So it's been really difficult to date things directly. Probably maybe more recent teeth from maybe Neanderthal or something like that, if they can find things that don't look like, you know, they can make thin sections and microscopically study to see if they think there's new added material. So they can look for changes and then maybe try to date them. But for the most part, they have been totally unsuccessful in dating actual fossils themselves, even teeth.
But what about extracting the DNA?
The DNA can be extracted from bone marrow and teeth. And if it does degrade over time. So they have to be in areas where they're really not going to see a lot of moisture and air. If they've been kind of cut off and been in more anaerobic air, you know, so they don't start to decay. That's why all young bones aren't suitable for genetic studies. If they've been exposed to lots of air and water, the DNA degrades much more rapidly than those that are more protected and buried. So the oldest they've gotten successfully DNA is that 430 million year. And you know, I think they may have tried they probably have tried in older things and have just not been successful. So Mark might know more about how fast, you know, what's going to degrade, but it's greatly influenced by the environment in which that bone or tooth has been buried as to how well preserved, you know, the DNA is going to be.
Hi, Vicki, this is Bob. Thank you. Enjoying it very much. I'm interested in the rapid or very dramatic increase in brain size. And it's sort of a complex question, but what is the theory that about the natural selection? Let me rephrase that. What does the field currently think was the trait that led to a need for, an advantage for a larger brain size? Was it language ability, for instance? And is there any evidence in the change in the structure of the bones of the head that may reflect that there's a correlation between the brain structure getting bigger and perhaps vocalization improving?
I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the second half. As far as we can tell, and again, because most of these early hominins, we don't have any record of their culture. You know, we don't see the first true undisputed tools until 2.6 million. So those first, 1.5 million years, 2.5 million years, we have no way of knowing because we have no evidence of their culture. But it's thought that no, they were not verbal.
This is Ken. I recently read an article in Time magazine, I think it was, where there's serious work to restore the hairy mammoth, which of course went extinct fairly recently, from DNA from some 60 sites that they collected. And in fact, they have little mice running around now with the fur of the woolly mammoth. and that's just one tiny step in that right direction. But is it out of the question to think of restoring early hominoids from any of the DNA?
I hope so. Mark gave a talk not too long ago that talked about bringing back there are several different private industry groups that are working on trying to bring back extinct creatures. From what I've read of those, they can't just clone. They can't just clone the cells and actually make a mammoth. They have to breed. They have to create something, and then they breed it with a living elephant and all this sort of stuff. So bringing back early hominids, first of all, there is no DNA from them. I mean, we don't have anything nearly that, that old. We do have the Neanderthals. So I don't know, Mark, what do you think?
I think I need to do a presentation on it in the fall.
There we go, yeah. Meet the Neanderthals. You can have your DNA combined with that of a Neanderthal for your new child. What a horrible thought. Okay, I think it's time for our break, and I'll see you back at 11. Okay, so back to hominins. Okay, so there is a great diversity of hominin fossils around 2 million years as populations responded to environmental stress, particularly in the emerging Homo genus. Evolution proceeded in a mosaic pattern. That is, there are different characteristics patchily distributed in different groups in different regions over slightly different times. Lack of agreement among paleoanthropologists about how to make sense of this diversity has created grab bag species. So these have a high degree of physical heterogeneity in the fossil specimens. It's commonly referred to as the muddle in the middle. Derived traits used to define the genus Homo are fairly agreed upon. They don't all have them, but large brains, small teeth and jaws, long legs, small flat faces, habitual tool use, and meat eating. Homo habilis is the earliest member of the genus Homo in the fossil record, with an age range from 2.4 to 1.6 million years. The species is characterized by a slightly larger brain, smaller cheek teeth, and more human-like feet than earlier hominins. Members of this group were about 3 to 4 feet tall and about 70 pounds. They were makers and users of stone tools and likely more scavengers than hunters. Specimens commonly included in the genus Homo erectus have a huge morphological heterogeneity. Without doubt, several species are lumped into this one in terms of their evolution in both time and space. That said, Homo erectus is the longest lived of any hominin species, almost 2 million years, from 1.9 million to 100,000 years ago. Homo erectus was the first hominin with a modern body shape, stature, and limb proportions. They ranged from 4.5 to 6 feet tall and weighed between 90 and 150 pounds. They likely had a mode of walking and running similar to ours. However, the skull was not like that of modern humans. The brain case was smaller than ours. It was low and long, kind of shaped like a football, with a receding forehead, large brow ridges, and no chin. The skull had a bony ridge across the back called an occipital bun that gave the back of the skull a squared-off appearance. However, the face does show less prognostism compared to earlier hominins. The Homo erectus Nariokotomi boy is the most spectacular find of early Homo species. It was discovered in 1984 and dated at 1.5 million years. The adult cranium volume was estimated to be 900 cc's. Shoulder joints show that he was capable of throwing accurately at fairly long distances. The torso was slender and barrel-shaped rather than like ours, rather than cone-shaped like the Australopithecines. The early Homo erectus in Africa were fully committed ground dwellers in the savanna, having to contend with exposure to heat and sun. Although we have no fossil evidence to prove it, it is widely accepted that Homo erectus had a high density of sweat glands and was relatively hairless to allow sweat to be effective in providing evaporative cooling. Homo erectus are also believed to be dark-skinned to protect them from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. Improvement in stone tools around 1.6 million years happened with the introduction of the tear-shaped dropped hand axe, which is flaked on both sides to produce an efficient cutting tool. This tool was used for the next million years. The tool was capable of dismantling large carcasses, and its invention is generally credited to the Homo erectus. The brain is the most energy-consuming tissue in our body. The larger brain of Homo erectus could only be maintained by a diet of higher quality foods than savanna plants. Animal fat and protein were the best the savanna had to offer. Scavenging carcasses might have come first, but scavenging is a hit and miss proposition. You have to first locate remains and then compete with other scavengers. If one's diet starts to depend on meat, then hunting is the only way to ensure it. Archaeological sites of Homo erectus fossils in Africa contain abundant stone tools and large concentrations of butchered animal bones. Microscopic wear on the teeth also show that savanna plants continued to be part of their diet. Dietary versatility is advantageous, of course, for long-term survival. We have no evidence that Homo erectus developed hunting weapons. However, the long-legged, efficient walking hominid did have the ability for a new way to hunt. It's called endurance hunting. With enough water, members of Homo genus, and even those today, perhaps not us, but members of them, can walk all day long in tropical sun. A grazing savanna mammal could easily outrun Homo erectus, but in doing so, the animals become overheated and need to rest. The Homo erectus that doggedly followed them caused this scenario to be repeated a number of times until the animals succumbed to heat stroke and dehydration. Homo erectus could then dispatch it and butcher it before other scavengers arrive. It is said that Louis Leakey tried this successfully. There is one more major problem that had to be solved in order to obtain sufficient nutrition. The narrow pelvis and torso of Homo erectus made walking efficient, but it also required the gut to be much smaller than that of Australopithecus. Shifting from vegetarian ancestors required the ability to extract nutrients from meat in a shorter gut. For example, even though chimpanzees occasionally eat meat, they excrete most of it undigested. The best hypothesis for meeting the nutritional needs of Homo erectus is cooking. Cooking makes indigestible nutrients in both plant and animal materials available for digestion. It softens food and makes it easier to chew them so as teeth and jaw muscles decrease. It detoxifies rotting meat. Cooking requires control of fire. There is no certain evidence that hominids domesticated fire before 1 million years. So that's about 400,000 years after the invention of hand axes and the need for better nutrition. Evidence of the control of fire remains circumstantial for hominids between 1 and 2 million years. Although there is a case to be made that control of fire was needed for cooking, protection against predators in the savanna, and promotion of group cohesion and social development. It is generally agreed that Homo erectus was the first hominid to emigrate from Africa in several major movements, the first of which took place about 1.9 million years ago. They colonized Asia and Europe. Homo erectus was the most geographically widespread until the dispersal of Homo sapiens. The major migration routes used by Homo erectus were determined by changing geography during the Pleistocene. When periods of global cooling dominated, sea level was often 400 feet lower than it is today. Homo erectus was able to walk from the Southeast Asia mainland to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. There were also land bridges connection between Britain and continental Europe and North northern Asia and Alaska. Homo erectus, if we could go back and visit with Homo erectus and sit in this cave and experience one interglacial and one glacial period, this is the different view that we would see. So you can see there was a big difference in sea level change, and the Homo erectus could choose then during glacial times to get out of town. Okay. Glaciation made the northern areas inaccessible to human habitation during glacial periods. Not quite where the mark is between the tan and the green is where ice sheets formed. So obviously hominids are not going to be living on the ice sheets, and probably not and as close to the edge as they don't want to be either. During the human habitation, the Homo erectus probably stayed in the areas that are marked in green on the map. During the long span of Homo erectus, members of the group continued to develop adaptations to habitat and food sources. After all, they were now spread over a large part of the world, experiencing very different conditions, depending on whether they were in southern Africa or in Germany. So diversification and adaptation were key to survival. So diversification was occurring, which continued this big muddle in the middle of defining hominid species. There is one truly distinct hominid species in this time period that is clearly not Homo erectus, and that is Homo naledi. In 2013, close to 2,000 specimens from at least 18 individuals, including nearly complete skeletons, were found in a cave in South Africa. Named Homo naledi, these had characteristics of both Australopithecines and Homo. They were less than 5 feet tall, had strongly jutting faces, brain sizes between 460 and 610. The shape of the shoulder, the pelvis, the hip joint, and curved fingers were a little more like Australopithecines than Homo erectus, whereas the wrists, hands, feet, vertebrae, and jaws were more like Homo erectus than Australopithecines. The dentition was somewhere in between. It was guessed that they might be about 1.5 million age. So all were shocked when the modern dating methods placed these between 355 and 236,000 years. Hence, these somewhat archaic hominids coexisted with quite well derived traits of the Homo erectus. In addition to Homo naledi, there are a number of Homo species, not all agreed upon, between 600 and 200,000 years ago. They're sometimes lumped together as archaic Homo sapiens. But many scientists do recognize the species Homo heidelbergensis that lived from 600,000 to 200,000 years ago. There are specimens from East Africa, South Africa, North Africa, France, Germany, and England. They had brains similar in size to Homo sapiens, although differently shaped and more robust skulls, with attachments for stronger chewing muscles. They were similar in size to modern humans, with a more robust build. They are thought to have made the first compound tools by attaching stone tips to soft handles like bone and wood. They are also the first documented makers of artificial shelters. Remains are found on a beach in France of a 10-meter-long oval hut dated to be about 380,000 years old. Within the remains of this hut, and no, the trees aren't there, it was just the ring. They could just tell there was a structure there. Remains of a stone hearth and charred bones are found inside. There is one theory that Homo heidelbergensis gave rise to Homo sapiens in Africa and Homo neanderthalensis in Europe, i.e. that these might be the last common ancestor of these two species. In 2016, fragments of nuclear DNA extracted from that 430,000-year-old bone is thought to come from Homo heidelbergensis. The results show a very close relationship to Neanderthals and their close genetic cousins, the Denisovians. Until more genetic data are obtained, it's difficult to say what this means in terms of the evolution of these two species. Before moving on to Neanderthal, there is one other Homo species that lived between 190 and 50,000 years, it's up there circled in blue, on the island of Flores in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis. I said that right? A mostly complete skeleton with skull and parts of at least 11 other individuals have been recovered from multiple layers in one cave. One unusual feature of these hominins is their small stature. They stood only between 3 and 4 feet tall and weighed between 50 and 75 pounds. The short stature is thought to be insular dwarfism caused by long-term genetic isolation on the island. However, they have other features that are anomalous for their recent geologic age. This increases the complexity of understanding the hominid family tree. They had long and low cranial shape, long arms, a wide pelvis, and a relatively long foot for their body size. The foot lacked an arch, whereas all other Homo species at this time had a well-arched foot. These features are more similar to ancient hominids, maybe Homo habilis or the very earliest Homo erectus. And I'd also like to mention that in 2019, some hand and foot bones, teeth, and part of a femur were found on Luzon in the Philippines. And these are dated to 67,000 to 50,000 years. They also have a mosaic of modern and somewhat archaic traits. Studies on these are still ongoing. Neanderthals are the best known ancient humans because of the large number of their sites, providing thousands of artifacts and fossil specimens, including a number of nearly complete skeletons. Their genomes have been sequenced, at least about a dozen individuals so far. And the distinctive Neanderthal species, what we well characterized by their genomes, made its appearance about 200,000 years ago, and they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Homo neanderthalensis migrated within the region shown in blue as climate changed from glacial to interglacial, following the warmer climate and their mammal and vegetation sources of food. Here we can compare these two incredibly buff examples. This was actually from the New Zealand Geographic. I saw them just cracked me up. Had to put it in. Anyway, here of Neanderthal and human. So the adult male Neanderthal stood about 5 to 5 3/4 feet tall and weighed on average 140 to 180 pounds. They had wide, bulky bodies and limbs shorter than those of Homo sapiens. These proportions are typical for people living in cold climates. Their skull was long and low with an occipital bun. The occipital bun is used for muscle attachments for chewing. Brain volume ranged from 1,200 to 1,750, so on average larger than the modern Homo sapien. I do want to point out here that early Homo sapien brains were larger than ours. Our brain has gotten smaller in the last 10,000 years. So the early Homo brain was about 1,500 cc's. Facial features include a sloped forehead, thick brow ridge, slightly protruding face, no chin, and teeth and jaws larger than modern humans. Neanderthal sites are spread thinly over their large region and show occupation mostly of small groups, typically about a dozen people, maybe up to a maximum of 30. Their diets were variable depending on where they lived. Some groups consumed mostly plants. We can look at teeth of some Neanderthal, and they were pretty much vegetarians. And we look at others, and they pretty much ate nothing but meat. So they are also the first to have good evidence of wearing clothing in cold climates and using animal hides as bedding and possibly to cover structures. Neanderthals made good tools for cutting and scraping. They made spear points and bone awls for piercing hides. Neanderthals were smart. They made clothes, good tools, had strategies to survive cold in many parts of their range, and to have light deep in caves. They were sometimes able to help injured members heal and to care for members of their group. Did they communicate verbally? Highly likely, supplemented by gestures as we do, but is verbal communication the same as language? Does aesthetic appreciation, care of others, require that Neanderthals thought like we do? Symbolic thinking is the ability to use symbols such as language, numbers, and images to represent abstract concepts and ideas and experiences. It's the capacity to understand and manipulate meaning beyond just the physical world. It allows creating alternative worlds in your head, imagining stories that never happened, and creating art and music. In contrast, intuitive thinking is understanding the immediate world, seeing ways to solve immediate problems, to read nature, to anticipate good and bad situations, and formulate a plan to act accordingly. Humans use both symbolic and intuitive thinking. Did other hominids too? Is intuitive thinking enough to communicate immediate concerns and needs, to understand how to care for injuries, to have strong personal attachments, maybe even to appreciate a sunset? This thinking is smart, but it's not the same as symbolic thinking. There is not enough evidence now to determine how other hominins thought. And to be honest, it's hard for us to think of another way than what we possess. But we do see that evidence of creation of art is very scarce until the arrival of Homo sapiens. So here we are. We have already looked at the characteristics of Homo sapiens, compared physically to the hominids that came before us. We are slenderly built. I have never been called slenderly built. I'm taking it. We are slenderly built. with narrow pelvises and barrel-shaped ribs. Our skulls are high, short, and rounded. Our faces are small and retracted below our brain cases, with tall foreheads and projecting nasal bones. Our brow ridges are small and always divided. Our teeth are small and arranged in a parabolic shape. We are the only hominin to have a true chin in front of our lower jaw. The oldest Homo sapien fossils are found in Ethiopia, dated between 195 and 160,000 years. This approximately 200,000 year date is in good agreement with molecular clock dates for the origin of Homo sapien. Homo sapiens seem to have behaved as all other members of Homo before them for the first 100 to 120,000 years of their existence as they spread into other parts of Africa. The first evidence that something changed was found in cave deposits in South Africa, dated to be about 80 to 75,000 years old. These are intentionally marked and decorated clay plaques and abundant shell necklaces. You can't start doing new things unless the biology is there. When humans started acquiring anatomical adaptations that we see preserved in teeth and bones, they must also have acquired changes in the brain. The enhanced potential for making mental associations seems to have been unused for the first 100,000 years. But when it was finally recruited by some cultural or behavioral stimulus, it changed the species forever. One of the best candidates put forth as the stimulus is the invention of language. Because language maps perfectly onto symbolic thought. It is impossible for us to conceive of thought without language to explain it to ourselves as well as to others. Australopithecus, Homo erectus, even Neanderthals had lengthy spans of existence on Earth, but none of them developed technology advances remotely as rapidly as those developed by Homo sapiens. Major migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa beginning about 60,000 years ago. They took with them this cognitive ability, producing astonishing works of cave painting, still preserved in France and in Indonesia. Homo sapiens reached all parts of the world except Antarctica, and we know they interacted with Neanderthals from DNA evidence. They might also have encountered other hominin populations in Indonesia and the Philippines, and others we have no record of. But at some point, about 40,000 years ago, for the first time in millions of years, Homo sapiens was the only hominid species on Earth. Are we alone as a hominid species because Homo sapiens actively and intentionally eliminated all others? Probably not. There is no evidence at Neanderthal sites of massacres. What is likely is that other Homo populations around the world were thinly scattered and small, growing inbred and under environmental stress. We do see evidence of this in the Neanderthal DNA studies so far. In the closing phase of the Pleistocene epoch, Earth experienced one last glacial phase, causing stress on animals and plant food sources, where populations of Homo sapiens entered areas inhabited by other Homo populations. They were likely as able or better able to compete for limited resources. And the other small population of Homo species died out. We are alone, the last branch on the bushy tree of hominid evolution. Thank you.
Hi, Vicki. This is Gwen Ellen. Is there any indication of when Homo sapiens became white?
There is, and I've forgotten what it is. Now, Neanderthal, from the DNA, they know that they were fair-skinned, often with blue eyes and red hair. A lot of Neanderthal from the DNA. Homo sapiens certainly started out as dark-skinned. And I did read something, and I can't remember when it was, that the ones that moved further north, obviously Homo sapiens in Africa stayed dark-skinned because they needed to for the UV radiation. But I can't remember when the northern ones did. I will go look that up.
Hi, this is Mark, and I'll ask this controversial question in light of your last statement, which is both Charles Darwin and Louis Leakey and subsequently Richard Leakey all posited that we're living in a time of evolution of mankind and that there is Homo sapien and Homo sapien sapien. And I know that that argument came out very close to the whole politicization of the eugenics movement, which has quashed that avenue of research, but they had ample genetic and fossil data that what's the status of that argument?
I think it's racist theory. I don't believe it at all. Yes, all organisms, they show differentiation. So from the Homo that existed 200,000 years ago, we are different. Our brains have gotten smaller, we're all this, but we're still genetically Homo sapiens. Are we still evolving? Well, I belong to the punctuated equilibrium school of evolution, which says that creation of new species has to happen in small, isolated populations that are not interbreeding with large numbers. Okay, Homo sapiens are worldwide. There is, they're all. So, as far as I'm concerned, we are not evolving. We may be devolving. No, we're not evolving. I don't, believe. So, is there potential in the future if most of us die out and they're small, isolated populations? We might well. There may be other hominins that evolve from us. But as we are right now with this massive genetic pool, I don't see chances of creating a new hominin species.
So a follow-up to that question. Does that mean our brains are not shrinking anymore? At least most of our brains?
We know that we looked at some of the older, some of the earlier hominids, the pre-10,000 year. It's been a fairly recent thing where our brain has shrunk a little bit. And I read something about why. And it doesn't mean that we're less smart or the early hominids were more smarter. More smarter? That's terrible. We're smarter. I've been up here too long. And I can't remember their theory of why it's shrinking. But it doesn't have anything to do with loss of intelligence. It may be that we're using less other parts of our brain. Ken, anybody know any reason why? Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Oh, who's next? Ken? You? Me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's Jeff, that annoying
Jeff, yeah.
evolutionary biologist from Montana. But excellent job.
Thank you.
You are going to be a tough act to follow. I'm not giving any more talks after this. But there's so many intriguing questions to ask, like the social brain hypothesis, hunting in the evolution of science in Africa, language, as you mentioned, meat, all sorts of self-domestication. But I want to do with a little bit of a wide-angle lens, and 1850-something Darwin and his epical work, the Scopes trial in the 1920s. I think where we've come, it still seems that evolutionary biology is not accepted by so much of the population when it has, in my mind, so much explanatory power. And then focusing out a bit more, where have we gone wrong as scientists, that science is being questioned so much? So as an educator, a superb one yourself, can you reflect for a couple seconds or a couple years on what we could be doing better to communicate science? Easy answer, I'm sure.
Really? Elect the right people to school boards?
Hi, this is Ken. About the brains getting smaller and whether we're smarter or not, you aren't nearly as likely to die early hoeing your field as you are out in the savannah competing with the big game animals. So it may be that we don't have to be as smart as we used to be, and maybe we aren't. I think there are several other indications that we are still evolving, and I'm not going to go into that too much because I didn't know you were giving this talk, and you probably don't know that I'm giving a parallel talk early next semester. So we can compare the two and have a fight after, okay?
Hello, this is Priscilla. I'm wondering what we have learned from the petroglyphs.
Petroglyphs?
Yes.
Those are the ones that I know of. You're not talking about the cave paintings?
No.
The very recent, the native peoples? I mean, what do we learn from them? I mean, we're just seeing an aspect of their culture, what they, that they, in a way, it's similar to, I think, the cave paintings of depicting the world around them and trying to make a lasting thing. I know I did my fieldwork in the outback in northern Western Australia, and I came across lots of petroglyphs from the Aborigine. And they do have ceremonies. It's part of their initiation for manhood, where they go into the caves and they repaint them. They touch them up, so they keep them vibrant and things. So it's part of the thing. They are, believe that they probably, originated, early when the great being, put them there. They have these. And it's their tradition to keep that going by keeping these paintings alive and vibrant.
Hi, over here. I'm Christine. I really, really enjoyed this, so thank you for that. And I just wanted to tell people about a show I saw recently from the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, in which an archaeologist gave a discussion about how he had decided to believe that people were making clothing in cold weather places in the Americas and not in warm weather places in the Americas. And that is because, all that clothing stuff disintegrates pretty easily, unless it's sagebrush sandals in a cave somewhere. But and he had evaluated the stone tools and decided that a certain kind of a tool was a scraper to scrape flesh from hides, and certain other tools were needles, and certain other tools were awls and whatnot, which is obvious. But that the incidence of those stone clothes-making tools was 10 times, those were 10 times as common in cold weather places, including up a mountain versus down a mountain versus north versus south. And I just found that to be very interesting, because I was trying to figure out from your talk what would be evidence of culture, because that's all going to rot.
Right. Nope. There is one other thing that they see in Neanderthal, and that is their front teeth are very worn. And they believe what they did was hold the hides in their mouths as they scraped and made clothes and made their clothing. Because they don't see this kind of wear on the incisors and things in other species. So they think they used their teeth as tools, which my dentist tells me they're treasures, not tools. So, but to the Neanderthal, they apparently did use their teeth. They, in fact, a lot of reference calls it the third hand. Because, so there's evidence that yes, they were working hides, and that included holding them so they could scrape very delicately and maybe sew too to hold them in their mouths.
Okay, Vicki, this is Tom. Would it be reasonable to suggest that the evolution of language coincides with the evolution of symbolic art? Because on the one hand, you had Neanderthals and a lot of the other hominins making practical stone tools for pragmatic purposes. But from what you said, it was only Homo sapiens who, at a certain point, what Harari calls the cognitive revolution, started actually making symbolic art. So do you think art and digital language co-evolved?
I think so. I think if it's if that's when we actually started using cognitive thinking, symbolic thinking. What was I going to say about that? I had something to say. Oh well, it's gone now. I know. It was the changes in the brain are thought maybe to have allowed, for the first time, different parts of the brain to communicate, that there's more interchange between different parts of the brain, and that was one cognitive thing in the Homo sapien that maybe other species did not have, that their brains didn't connect the way Homo sapiens did, and that ultimately allowed the different parts of the brain communicating more, allowed us to develop symbolic thinking, which would include language, art, thought, everything. They all had to come together, right? Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Mako.
Hi, Mako.
I haven't thought about this author for a long time, but I'm sure she's an Oregonian, and she wrote, the first book was The Clan of the Cave Bear. Her name was Jean Auel, and then she wrote many, many more subsequent novels. And I wondered whether, I always thought when I read it that she must have done an awful lot of research, but what is your opinion about her series?
I read the first one, which I thought was pretty good. I read the second one, which I thought was pretty much soft porn. Did not care for no. But the first one I thought was quite interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I just wanted to comment. Old brains shrink. So could it be that you're comparing, like the life expectancy of somebody, hundreds of years ago with the ones now? Because, you get old.
Right. I don't think that's their statistics are just looking at the fact that old people's brains are maybe smaller than young people's brains. The difference is not that. It's not from 1,500 cubic centimeters to 1,400. So they think that's not. Our brains don't shrink that much between, when we're 10 and when we're 70. So. I don't think so.
Hi.
Or maybe rattling around.
Susan again. Going back to this thing about holding the hide in their teeth. Mm-hmm. Now, the evidence is the worn teeth. Mm-hmm. So how do these how does the science work to come up with the idea of why the teeth are that way? So that idea of holding the hide, there's no way to prove it, right?
No.
So
There's no way to prove a lot of this.
Well, that's what I was sort of getting at, actually. I was just thinking that's an example of it. So
Right.
is there some like consensus, or are there parallel theories of these, what the evidence people think it is behind it, I guess?
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than I could present of seeing maybe where Neanderthals, do the ones in colder areas have more worn teeth than those in warmer areas? That I don't know. But I mean, I'm sure I could find a lot of articles that would indicate, why they thought it had to be holding hides. They had to be holding something in their mouth and pulling on it. So you don't chew with your incisors. So. So her question was, did this change over time?
No, I mean now. Are there things that people said about this maybe 50 years ago, and now they're saying something different?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know whether 50 years ago they interpreted wear on the teeth in a different way.
This general idea of taking evidence and coming up with a theory, does it change in this kind of study over periods? Does it change?
Okay, yes. The question asked, do theories change over time, or how we interpret this piece of evidence versus that piece of evidence? Yes, it changes a lot. And because we get more and more evidence, we use more and more technology. They're using now, when they're imaging teeth, they actually can look at growth rings and determine, like the age of the Narukatmi boy. They thought originally he was like 12 or 13 when he died, and by studying the teeth, they realized he was about 8. And the reason is because earlier Homo species didn't develop at the same rate we do. Homo sapiens have a very slow development rate. We have a prolonged childhood, whereas they've shown that in many species when they find the babies and look at when teeth erupt and can look at growth rings and stuff in teeth to see how old they were, and they see that they developed at a much faster rate than modern humans. They did not have as long a prolonged childhood as we did. That also gives them less time to learn because they become adults sooner and probably reproductively active sooner.
Hi, Vicki, this is Eric. When we talk about these time continuums of millions of years, I know it's a much more recent time period, probably thousands of years, but when were Homo sapiens, for example, first thought to be on the North American continent and in the Americas?
In the Americas, that's been controversial. They were at least in the New World by between, I think the estimates, if I remember correctly, it varies widely. I think it's been between like 30 and 50. Some people, some sites that have been like, oh, this is evidence of occupation. They look at it and other people go there and go, no. I've seen the one in the Mojave Desert as an early man site near Barstow. It's on an alluvial fan, first of all, and that's not going to preserve anything for any length of time. But there are some good evidence. I'll have to go look at that to see what the best. Somebody here might know what they think the best evidence right now is for the occupation. But they move fast. It's amazing when the first sites they see up in Alaska to when they see them in South America. It's astonishingly fast. I mean, it's in Australia, and they moved in from Borneo and the other areas there. Yeah. Oh, Australia was 1.7?
It's 40.
40,000. Okay, 40,000. Okay. And I think they came from Borneo, right? Yeah.
Well, this is Gwen Ellen again, and my question kind of follows up with that because, and I understand that the maps that you showed, like the glacial and stuff like that, are based on how we know the world now. Are there any maps that show the migration or anything based on the world as it was back then? And how land was connected more than it is now?
That pretty much shows it. I mean, they didn't show yes, there are lots of illustrations you can find that show the land bridges. Yeah. And in fact, there is, as I said, there was a land bridge between Europe and Britain. And although there are the first permanent things that they find are the Homo heidelbergensis. However, they did find footprints that are 950,000 years old in Britain. So that would, yeah. So there, I think I have the date right. I will go check that. But anyway, there were they found footprints that are much older than any evidence of actual occupation there. Mm-hmm.
Something that has changed recently, they found sticks that had 28 marks. And finally, one of the women said, well, what is that? 28 days. Menstrual cycle.
A stick? I didn't follow your...
Oh, there were some sticks found that had 28 marks on them.
Uh-huh.
And none of the men could figure it out, and one of the women said, it's menstrual cycle. It's probably true.
Okay.
Another piece of evidence they get kind of similar to the teeth thing from fossil record, what the people were doing. They studied the physical injuries to Neanderthals and compared them to modern humans. And the group that came closest was rodeo cowboys.
Yes, I read that too.
So
yes,
apparently these guys were going mano to mano with big animals.
That's correct. Yes, I read that too. That is the broken bone. The injuries are most closely to rodeo riders. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dean. I just wanted to make a comment that on the subject of evolving or devolving. I think there is some devolving going on, but it's mostly localized in Washington, D.C.
This is more of a statement. This is David again. In looking at the last slide, I think a couple of hours on the Younger Dryas would be an excellent way to spend my time.
There's a lot more information. The closer we are in time, we can get a lot of information. Right? Yep. Okay. Okay. Last question.
Okay. On ancestry testing, 23andMe, there's actually a place on the testing that lists your percentage of Neanderthal percentage.
Yeah, they do have that. It does vary, and they can look at the early Homo has about 4%. Typical now of modern humans is 2% or less, and there's none in Africa. Well, actually, it's like 0.2, probably for some crossback of Europeans been to Africa. But there was no interbreeding. The Neanderthal did not go into Africa. There's no evidence that they ever crossed into Africa. Okay, thank you.